Good evening, everyone. I'm Mark Greenfield, your guest host for this evening's edition of Higher Ed Live, the weekly web show for marketing and web professionals. Tune in to Higher Ed Live on Thursday nights at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on higheredlive.com and join in the conversation on Twitter using the #Higher Ed Live hashtag. You can follow me at MarkGR on Twitter. For those of you who don't know me, I am the Director of Web Services at the University at Buffalo. I am also the conference chair for the annual Higher Education Web Professionals Conference coming up in Buffalo in just over 2 weeks. If you are going to be in Buffalo, make sure you stop by and say hello. Tonight's show is all about the flattening of higher education. Flatten comes from Tom Friedman's book, The World is Flat, and is defined as when the impact of the internet and globalization render an industry unrecognizable and in many cases obsolete. Will higher ed become unrecognizable? Will it become obsolete? Let's spend the next hour exploring the future of higher education. Before we get into our topic tonight, I'd like to give a few shout outs to our sponsors. OmniUpdate is the leading web content management system provider for higher education. The company's web CMS, OU Campus, is secure and scalable with great tools and features, deployment flexibility, and an awesome user community. Looking to go mobile? Check out OmniUpdate's new case study on creating a mobile app with Tarrant County College. We're tweeting a link out now. Higher Ed Live is sponsored by Uversity, formerly Integral, the creators of the Schools app, a private Facebook community to boost enrollment and retention. Check out their blog, Uversity Roundtable, for posts on admissions marketing, student engagement, and social media in higher education. We're tweeting the link to the blog now. Next month, M. Stoner, a marketing communications agency focused on higher education web strategy and development since 2001, is presenting a 3-part web analytics webinar series. You know the data you're collecting is important, but how do you put it to use? How do you align this data with institutional objectives? How do you take advantage of Google's advanced features in custom reporting, event clicks, or funnels? You'll get the answer to these questions and sharpen your knowledge of Google Analytics with M. Stoner's webinar series. We are tweeting out a link now where you can learn more about the series and register. Institutions can register for individual webinars or receive a discount by signing up for all 3. So tonight we are going to break format a bit, and I'll be flying solo with no guests. For better or worse, it's just me for the next hour. I've been talking about this topic since about 2006, and in fact I was on an earlier show on Higher Ed Live back in 2010, and the show we called back then was called The Axeman Cometh, and kind of focused on what our future holds in terms of what jobs will be available for us in higher ed in the future. What I want to do today is take a little more global and higher level look at where higher ed is going and what we might expect as we look, into our crystal balls 5 or 10 years down the road. Just to provide you with a little background, I was an economics major and I studied economics back in the mid 1970s, not to date myself. And it's been interesting as I've watched what the web and what the internet has done to the science, the art of economics. Back in the early 1990s, I read a book called The Death of Distance, and it really talked about how communications technology was going to make distance irrelevant. And that book actually got me started thinking about a career in the web, and for the last 17 years now, this has been my full-time job. One of the things that relates back to the death of distance is something Bill Gates has been talking about, and that's kind of the declining importance of what he calls place-based education. Going forward, having physical access to an academic institution where you physically are on a campus, given the tools at our disposal now, probably will not be quite as important. In fact, we'll send a link out to this article from the Chronicle that was written a couple years ago. So as an economics major, I was very interested in the work of Chris Anderson. You may have heard of him. His most famous book is called The Long Tail. Um, my favorite book by him, however, is called Free, and it really looks at the difference between when we move from atoms, the physical world, to bits, the digital world, and it really is rewriting a lot of the rules. When I was an economics major, the study of economics was all about scarcity and how we reacted to scarce resources. But what we're seeing now with the internet is we're moving from scarcity to abundance. I don't want to get too kind of, taking on the role of a teacher here, but I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about economics. And one of the things you get taught in economics is that in a competitive market, prices fall to marginal costs, and the marginal cost of bits is zero. So there really is no additional cost when you start adding on extra people when you think about something like a Mooc. And from an economics perspective, that's what really fascinates me about Moocs, is that we're able to teach hundreds of thousands of people at the same time, and the marginal cost of adding those people is virtually zero. And going back to what I just said, ultimately the price point for things that can be delivered this way is zero. And then you have to think about what is the impact in higher ed as we start to move to this digital model. Many of you have heard me tell this story before, but I'm going to share it again. I have a daughter who is in 8th grade right now, and as we do financial planning for her college education, the school I use as a benchmark is Cornell. I lived in Ithaca for a while. Cornell obviously is a great school. Not the most expensive school, but certainly one that is up there in terms of tuition. So I want you to take a guess at how much it will cost, or at least a prediction of what it will cost to get a bachelor's degree from Cornell University starting in the year 2018. The answer to that is about $375,000. So think about that a bit. That is a lot of money. Good education, I'm not going to get into discussion about whether it's worth that. I mean, you can make a fairly solid argument that in many cases it is worth that kind of investment. But you have to now compare that against some other options out there. I think the announcement of edX a couple of years ago, actually a year and a half ago now, is something we're going to look back on as being very important. Historically, MIT has provided access to their lectures online for about a decade. What edX did, and why it matters, is that now all of a sudden you had credentials with that course. So you have to ask yourself, is it worth that $375,000 a year to go to Cornell? Or what if I could take courses through edX that are offered by Harvard and MIT faculty, taught by their faculty, done at the academic rigor of Harvard and MIT, and do that for free or for very marginal costs? And I think that's really going to be a game changer when we start looking at the economic model of higher education. I was on a panel discussion with some folks from inside higher ed about a year ago now at Drexel University, and we were talking about kind of the future of technology and the impact it's going to have on higher ed. And one of the moderators on the panel asked the question to the provost at Drexel, when will Drexel be accepting Moocs for credit? And he thought about that for a couple of seconds, and his answer back was basically sooner than most people think. And again, when that starts to happen, we're going to see a big shift in the business model of higher ed. I want you to take, on your own campuses right now, do this little exercise. Take the amount of tuition for a year and then divide that by 5. Actually, you can divide it by 10 if you want to do a year long. And you'll come up with the cost per course. All right, when you think about those large lecture halls where you have 500 people in a class, multiply it by that cost per class, and you will come up with a very large number. This is the amount of money that your college or university makes from having that course get taught. And in many situations, that course is actually taught by an adjunct faculty member or a teaching assistant, which helps lower the cost of actually producing and generating that course. I'm going to be very interested to see what happens if Moocs start to replace some of those general education basic survey courses and colleges start to accept that for credit, because that will fundamentally undermine the basic business model in higher education. And that's when things are going to get really interesting. This past spring, William Bennett, who was the former Secretary of Education back in the Reagan years, came out with a book that got quite a bit of publicity, quite a bit of notoriety. Actually, I have a copy of it right here, called Is College Worth It? He, in many interviews, has said that in his opinion, only 150 of the 3,500 US colleges are worth the investment. So think about that. There's only a small handful of colleges out there where you're actually getting a solid return on investment. I personally think that number is low, but it also, the fact that we're having this conversation really raises some ideas about people questioning the value of education and now starting to look at if there are other options to get that education that maybe aren't quite as exciting or as expensive. So I want to spend, that's a little bit of background about this idea of higher ed and how it may be flattened. What I want to do over the course of the next half hour or so is get into some kind of interesting questions about where higher ed may be going. The first thing I want to talk about is the concept of disaggregation. And what that basically means is an unbundling of the parts. And one of the trends I'm starting to see in higher ed right now is a move from a vertical model to a horizontal model. Typically on a higher education, on a college campus, you will see everything being done. So the campus provides housing, they provide food, they provide education, they provide recreation, everything gets bundled together. But what we've started to see over the last decade or so is the unbundling of these services. So for instance, most college campuses now will have a Starbucks where you can go and buy coffee because colleges realize they're not in the coffee business, they're in the teaching and learning business, so let's outsource, so let's unbundle that portion of it. You're seeing a lot of apartments and, you know, what would typically be off-campus housing starting to show up in and around college campuses, and most colleges, again, realize that they're not in the housing business anymore. They're really in the teaching and learning business, and there might be an option to be able to outsource that. But one of the things that I'm really fascinated with now is not really the outsourcing of housing or dining, but how we are starting to see the unbundling of the actual process of teaching a college course. So there are a lot of technologies available now that will start to disaggregate that, where you will have somebody who specializes in creating the course content, an instructional designer who really is trained in how to use technology, who understands pedagogy, and will be the person who creates that course. Something that, typically all of this was done by a faculty member. They would create the course, they would deliver the course, they would grade the course, they would analyze the quality of the course. But now we're seeing tools develop where this is being unbundled and different companies, different pieces will start to do that. And that's, again, when I think about the Moocs, when I think about Coursera and think about Udacity, that's the piece that really fascinates me. Will Coursera ever be used as kind of the delivery mechanism for courses? I work at the University of Buffalo. We are part of the Suny system, and there was big news in the spring where Suny is one of, I believe, 10 public higher education systems that has signed on with Coursera to help use the Coursera platform as a way to deliver their online learning. So pay attention to that. I'm going to be very curious to see how much Coursera grows. And one of the questions I'm asking myself is, at some point, will Coursera become the new college catalog? This also raises a very interesting question, which has lots of ramifications. What will happen if at some point down the road, students are able to get their college degree from multiple colleges? So for example, if I want to take an economics course, technology exists today that would allow me to take it from a Nobel Prize winning faculty member at the London School of Economics. Or if I was interested in an engineering course, I could just go ahead and take that from MIT and then basically build my own degree. collect all, be able to take classes not from a single institution, but take that from a bunch of colleges where I can basically design my own curriculum and take advantage of all of the expertise that's out there. Again, going back to Suny, Suny is starting to move this in this direction with their Open Suny project. I don't have a link ready right now. I will at the end of the show send this out. But what Open Suny is looking at leveraging the power of all 64 Suny campuses and being able to provide a Suny online degree by having people take courses from multiple campuses. So think about what that means in terms of almost everything we think about in terms of higher education. One of the things that pops into mind immediately is financial aid. If I'm not taking all of my courses from a single campus, but have those spread out over several campuses, will financial aid be able to adjust to that? If I end up getting my degree from several campuses, from several colleges, who gets credit for, who am I an alumni of? What college did I actually graduate from if I graduated from many colleges? That has really interesting ramifications for people who are in the alumni and development end of the student life cycle about what the future may be for people and what their affiliation is with a single campus. So there's been a lot of people writing about this. I'm going to be very curious to see as we go forward, will this actually happen where you can start to build your own degree, build your own education, and really leverage everything that's out there. Another economics term is this idea of disintermediation. That's a very fancy term for eliminating the middleman. Think about what Amazon has done to all the brick and mortar bookstores around the country, around the world, for better or worse. A lot of those companies simply can't stay in business anymore because there's a way to disintermediate by having the two parties, the people who want to buy a book and the wholesalers, take that middleman out of that transaction. I'm wondering whether we might see something similar to that happen in higher education. And you're starting to see this with platforms like Udacity and Coursera. The founders of Coursera were faculty members at Stanford. They have decided not to offer their courses through Stanford anymore, but teach those courses through Coursera. You are still getting, some of the best faculty members in the world. You're being taught the same kind of material, but Stanford as a middleman has been taken out of that equation. And I'm wondering whether in the future, will some of the star faculty members decide, what, I'm not going to teach on a college campus. I'm going to be a, quote, what I call a free agent faculty member, and I'm just going to go out there and choose my platform or platforms and teach my class. And, my guess is at some point they'll figure out the financial structure for all of this, and somebody can probably make a very good living as a faculty member teaching without being affiliated with a particular college or university. I have a lot of friends who are faculty members, and it is a challenging time to be a faculty member on many fronts. And one of the challenges for younger faculty right now is that there are not a lot of tenure track positions available. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. So if I really am interested in teaching college level courses, perhaps there is a kind of alternative to teach these through online platforms and teach that way. So I'd be curious about your thoughts, whether you think this may happen. So anyways, this is a little bit different show. So let me just remind you, I am kind of monitoring the back channel on Twitter. If you have ideas about whether this will fly, will not fly, your interpretation of some of these, feel free to jump up on Twitter, and I will try to respond to questions and comments on Twitter as well as we go through this. Okay, let's move on to another interesting question. And that is, what will happen if the credit hour is no longer the currency of higher education? Most of us are very familiar with the credit hour. We take 15 credit hours per semester. We need 120 credit hours to graduate. There is contact time built into expectations about, the difference between a 1 credit hour course and a 3 credit hour course. And I think that we may start to be seeing the end of the credit hour as the main way we measure progress through higher education. What'll happen if we actually can come up with a way to measure student outcomes, learning outcomes, not by how much time they spend sitting in front of, sitting in a class, but what they actually learn. So one of my favorite quotes is, what if stuff learned mattered more than time served? I've been in many college classes, many high school classes, some of my coaching experience. I always see something like this happen where I remember walking into my daughter's math class back when she was in, I think, 5th or 6th grade. And as you watch the people, the students in that class, half of them were very bored because the pace of instruction was too slow. The other half were struggling and very frustrated because they couldn't keep up with what the faculty member, what the teacher was actually teaching. And what's interesting to me now is that there actually is technology that allows people to move at their own pace. What if we could actually have people learn at their own pace and have it based on competencies, not just based on how much time you have spent sitting in a classroom? Now, historically, we've seen some of this where AP credit, where you can take college level courses in high school and actually bring those credit forward. But what I'm thinking is that we may see this in a much more robust way where we start to measure learning outcomes, measure what people have learned as opposed to how much time they've been in a seat. There was a very important ruling last springtime from the Department of Education where they are now granting financial aid to colleges who use competency-based learning. So I think that's going to be a big step forward in terms of this becoming a very legitimate way to look about how you can get a degree. Another interesting thing and another question to ask is, what will happen if higher education loses their monopoly on credentialing? Just how important is that college degree, that piece of paper, when somebody is walking into a job interview and that is really the one credential they're showing people? I've had this debate among higher education web folks going back probably 15 or 20 years about how important is a college degree, that certificate, that piece of paper for somebody who wants to go into web programming or web development. Now, it's gotten better, but there are still only a handful of colleges that I know that teach the exact core skills that somebody who wants to come work for me as a web developer needs to know. Compare that to a place like GitHub, where people can go out on GitHub, publish their code, people comment on the code, and I'll tell you that I put just as much credence into somebody who has been developing, open source code on GitHub that is really quality code. I can look at their work, it's well respected. That almost means more to me, and it may mean more to me than if that person has a degree from, a computer science department, even at a prestigious school. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens if higher ed starts to lose that monopoly on credentialing. I've read lots of stories over the years about how businesses don't feel that colleges are preparing students with the right skill set. There is opportunity now for other people to jump in and start to train people, whether it's through Moocs or something like that, and offer some sort of credential. So the idea of badges in higher education to me is very fascinating. What happens if people start to earn badges or these small certificates through Moocs and other things, and employers start to recognize that as a legitimate credential? What does that mean to higher ed if we start going through a transition like that? I want to send out a link here about a recent article. It was just in the Chronicle this week where MIT now is starting to offer a MOOC curricula. So instead of just offering single courses, MIT is starting to bundle those together and offer a curriculum, not just single courses. And my guess, depending on what the subject matter is, it's only a matter of time until employers start to look at that as a valuable credential. So certainly some things to think about there. So let me just take a really quick break here. I'd like anybody out there on Twitter, if you have any kind of comments or questions about this, feel free to use the Higher Ed Live hashtag. I'd be curious whether people think this is something that we see coming, something that may not be coming. And let me just take a quick break here and see if we get any questions coming in on the hashtag. So I do see that somebody has posted out the new Open Suny website. I have been involved with that project indirectly, working on the Suny Learning Commons. And as I mentioned before, it's really going to be interesting to see how Open Suny plays out over the next couple of years. All right, I'm seeing another comment here on, as we look at free agent faculty, whether we should be exploring more remote working possibilities for staff in higher ed. My take on that is that if higher ed wants to attract quality people and keep quality people, they are going to have to offer options in terms of flex time and even working remotely to be able to keep talent. And going back to that idea of the death of distance, I think a lot of the work that gets done in higher ed, especially the more technical work, you don't physically have to be located on a campus. And I am certainly a big supporter of that. I remember reading an article a couple years ago about how Best Buy has a process, I believe it was, the acronym was ROW, which is results-oriented work environment. And when you were working in management at Best Buy, they didn't really care where you worked, when you worked, even how often you worked. All they really cared about was your output and you getting the job done. And I think in higher ed that we're going to have to start being more proactive and forward thinking about how we let people work in terms of flex time. One of the trends that I've seen over the last 4 or 5 years, and it's actually as somebody who's been working in higher ed for 25 years, working on the IT side of higher ed for all of that time, I am starting to see a number of my younger colleagues decide to leave higher ed. Very talented people, very passionate people, very enthusiastic people, all of whom would help higher ed move forward with everything I'm talking about right now, but many of them are leaving higher ed, and I can't say that I blame them. And I think that we need to be a lot more forward-thinking, proactive about remote work, about how we can collaborate, how we can use the technology going forward. So hopefully we'll see that happen as we go forward here. So just again, looking at a few of the comments here on Twitter. So there's a comment here about unbundling of housing and dining services from higher ed, but what happens about the, quote, college experience? And this gets back to me, one of the fundamental questions that we all need to ask about the future of higher ed and the role of higher ed, and that really has to do around liberal arts education. Is higher ed vocational training? Is it about just getting a job, or is it something higher than that, something where we really think about, you know, history and the role of society and how we can move society forward? All of the things you get in a liberal arts education. And I personally am concerned about this move toward really focusing on vocational training and maybe at the expense of liberal arts education. So I think that's a very important conversation to have going forward. I would hate to see colleges become just a job training program. I think getting back to the original question here, the college experience is very important. I remember when I was deciding where to go to school, whether I would do something locally or actually go away to school, in my experience, what I learned outside of the classroom, that college experience was just as important as what I learned in the classroom. And while social technology exists to kind of build some of that community, I don't think that's going to replace what the idea of being on a campus, you know, going through the traditional 4 years on campus, that experience really is something that I don't want to get lost. One of the things you'll hear me talk about all of the time as I look at the future of higher education is many paths to many places. I think for many people that vocational training is very important, and that's the path they should take. I also don't think the idea of your traditional liberal arts, you know, 4 years physically on a college campus is going to go away. What I do think will change is that's not the path that everybody's going to take. And I'm hoping that we are able to provide lots of options for people to choose the path they want to take and the one that's most appropriate to them. So anyways, I know there's been a lot of debate about the future of liberal arts education. I personally think it's very, very important and hope that we continue to focus on that. All right, let me just look at a couple of other quotes or a couple of other tweets here. As I look through some of these tweets, one of the things that, let me just talk for a couple minutes about Moocs. Moocs have really been interesting to me because they have taken, kind of public conversation about higher education by storm. I am absolutely amazed at the publicity that Moocs have been getting because that technology has been around for a long time. I remember over 20 years ago now helping build the first distance education classroom at UB, at the University of Buffalo. So we've been doing online education for a long time. And I think Moocs provide a lot of value. They can fill in a lot of the missing space in higher education and education in general right now. But I think too many people mistake the idea of a massively open online course with just an online course. So I think we're going to start to see kind of, there's lots of online education opportunities right now. I think we're going to start to see MOOC platforms being used to teach more traditional size classrooms. And, one of the questions I posed out there many times is, what is the ideal size of taking an online course? I have taken several courses through Coursera and edX, and some of them have had 100,000 people in them. Having a conversation in that environment has been very difficult. There are just too many people out there. So finding people who really share kind of your framework, your paradigm about what you're looking to take out of a course that size can be a challenge. But what if you brought that number down to a more manageable size? For those of you who have been studying social media for a while, you may be familiar with Dunbar's number. And Dunbar's number goes back to some anthropology work where what they determined was the number of people that you can have a friendship with at any given time is about 150 people. So what if you translated that to an online class and kept that enrollment in an online class at about 150 people? I've thought about this over the last few months, and I'm wondering whether that might really be a good target in terms of getting the best out of being able to talk with your classmates, but really leveraging what the efficiencies of teaching larger numbers of people might be able to offer. All right, let me go back to Twitter real quick here. All right, not seeing too much new there. So let me just move on to a couple other things as we talk about where higher ed is going. One of the best one of the best white papers I've read about higher ed and the future of higher ed is called An Avalanche is Coming. It came out in March of this year. It's about a 50-page white paper. We'll send a link out to that right now. I'd recommend taking a look at that. There's really some interesting concepts in there about, this idea of unbundling and where higher ed might be going and where it might be going on the global market. So that really is a good resource for you. If anybody is interested in everything that I have looked at over the last few years about the idea of the flattening of higher ed, we will send out the link to my Delicious account with the tag of flat. So right now there are about 900 articles in there that I've saved over the years talking about the flattening of higher ed. So lots of good information in there. A couple things to pay attention to as we go forward, and that really is the financial and fiscal health of the college that you work at. There was a survey of chief financial officers of colleges and universities, and in that survey, which was conducted, I believe, in the late springtime of this year, about a third of them said that their institution is on a financial path that is unsustainable. In the United States right now, there are about 4,500 colleges and universities. I'm wondering, in 5 years, in 10 years, how many of those colleges and universities will have gone out of business? I think the ones that are especially vulnerable are smaller liberal arts colleges. So as you look into this and kind of think about your own institution, a couple of questions to ask yourself is, one, what is your discount rate? What is the typical reduction in your published tuition that most of your students are getting? And then the second question to ask yourself is, what percentage of students are getting that discount? Across the country, for private colleges, not only is the number of students getting a discount rate going up, but the percentage, the amount of money that's being discounted is going up as well. And at the end of the day, that business model may not be sustainable. And really is something that concerns me. I am expecting, for better or worse, that over the next 5 or 10 years, we will be seeing several hundred colleges and universities probably shutting their doors or merging with other campuses. In that long list of delicious links that I've saved over the years, I've seen there's probably about 20 colleges that have gone out of business in the last 2 years. Another thing to think about is what will happen to individual academic departments on your campus. There's a book that has come out, I'll tweet this out later, called Prioritizing Academic Programs and Services. And one of my favorite quotes out of this book is that most colleges and universities can no longer afford what they've become. So take a look, especially if you work on a large university campus, take a look at how many students are enrolled in your master's and PhD programs. Should a large research university offer 300 degrees, and that's what we do at UB, that's what most large universities offer, that many degrees, but when you start to dig into it, what are the implications when many of those departments aren't enrolling students? I think you will see a time where they start to cut back on those programs that aren't generating enough interest in that area of study. And this gets back to the question I asked earlier about how important is liberal arts. A lot of students right now are really focused on getting a good, well-paying job, and maybe the liberal arts don't offer those kinds of opportunities. I would hate to see some of those departments close. But one option that technology may provide, especially across a statewide system, is what if you didn't offer every degree on your campus, but were able to offer this degree through another partner campus in the system-wide? And I think that's something that a lot of systems are going to start to explore over the next few years. Another thing to pay attention in terms of the financial viability of your institution going forward is just demographics of high school students. Here in New York State, the demographics are such that we are going to have a 16% reduction in the number of high school graduates over the next 5 or 6 years or so. So if you think you're going to continue to enroll that many students when there's just not that many students out there anymore, certainly something to think about. There are other parts of the country where it's the exact opposite, where the number of high school graduates are up 20% in certain parts of the South and certain parts of the West. So they might have some opportunity to grow out there. So certainly something to pay attention to is the financial stability of your institution. And hopefully you'll see some conversations about how your college, how your campus is going to deal with some of the financial reality as we go forward here. A lot of people, when I talk about higher education getting flattened and being disruptive, the first reaction is that this is negative and that, it's almost, to use another phrase I use all the time, the end of higher ed as we know it. I look at this as a huge opportunity to fix some of what's wrong with higher ed. What if we could use technology, use a lot of the tools at our disposal to make higher ed more affordable? What if we could improve access? And not just improve access in terms of finances, but improve it in terms of moving people through degrees. Out in California last year, there was a lot of conversation about the California schools using Moocs as a way to, provide the classes that there just wasn't enough enrollment space for people to move through it and get a degree in 2 years or 4 years. So what if we could use Moocs to kind of fill in some of those holes? And then the third thing, as I mentioned before, is that there's a lot of criticism that we're not preparing students for the workforce of the 21st century. So all of those things are things we need to be paying attention to going forward. All right, let me again take a quick look at Delicious here. And interesting comment here about how tough it is to push this through in a unionized environment. And I couldn't agree with that more. I'm not going to get in a public conversation about the roles unions should play going forward. If any of you see me, out and about, I'd be happy to talk about that in person with you. But I do think that if there is a lesson for unions in higher education, pay attention to what happened with the auto industry. And I will leave it at that. All right, let me just take a quick look through some other Delicious links here. Look out on Twitter here. And I think I have answered most of the questions. So what I want to do here is just close up with a couple of quotes that I use when I give this presentation in public. One of the first is from Will Rogers, if you remember Will Rogers, and the quote goes like this: "Even if you're on the right track, you'll get run over if you're just standing there." So I think we got to be thinking about the future, thinking about moving forward. The second quote and the last quote I want to share with you comes from Eric Hoffer, and the quote goes like this: "In times of change, learners inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists." The fact of the matter is that we have an education system that has not fundamentally changed in 125 years. We still teach the same way we taught primarily a century ago. And, if I can get up on my soapbox about technology for a minute, I think it is imperative and crucial that we start to really leverage technology to improve the way we teach, not just from an efficiency standpoint, but also from a pedagogical standpoint. There's so much opportunity out there to do that, we need to be thinking about that going forward. All right, let me just take one last look at Twitter, and I'm not seeing anything new. So with that, I want to thank you for your time. One quick note, if you are going to be at the High Ed Web Conference in Buffalo that's coming up in 2 weeks, I will be speaking on this topic there as well. I'll cover a lot of what I talked about tonight, but in more detail. I'm speaking on Monday morning, the first Monday of that conference. I'd certainly invite you to join me there. And to wrap this up, let me just give a little bit of a promo for next week's show. Join us next Thursday night on Higher Ed Live as Fran Zablocki and guests discuss future models for holistic, lifelong, multidisciplinary approaches to marketing and engagement. I certainly would recommend you take a drop in and listen to that show. Fran and I have actually talked about that in the past, really thinking about the student life cycle, and Fran has been speaking about this in many venues, and I certainly recommend you take a listen next week. And with that, I want to thank you for your time and enjoyed being back on Higher Ed Live, and we'll see you around. Thanks for your time.